Okay, let's take a look at math random. And so this is one we didn't touch on in the last lesson, and I purposely left it out. Let's look at random. And so when we want to create all right, at this point in time, I have given you all the tools. Trying and catching is how we gracefully. Let's talk about the this keyword. This is a keyword. I'm using the word this, and you can see it actually highlights red for me in my editor. This is a keyword that refers to the entire body of an object. It refers to the object that it belongs to. So let's go ahead and create a new object. Let's do const person5 is equal to, and let's say the name is going to be Caleb, and Caleb, comma, and I'm going to use an object literal here, which is the exact same thing as saying speak is equal to function speak, something like that, or rather speak is equal to function, and then something like that. Instead, we're shortcutting it, and we're just saying speak, and we can get rid of that. That is an object literal. And we want this to be console.log meow, because apparently I'm going to say meow today. And so I can execute this with person5.speak. And when I refresh my page, it says meow. And that's really nice. This is how we access an object. Now, this is called a method on this object because it's part of an object, like a function. Or a class or an object. This is called a method. Now, what if I wanted to say, my name is Caleb? Well, when I go back here and refresh, it says my name is Caleb, as expected. We know that was going to happen. But what if that name wanted to be dynamic? And what if I wanted this to be a variable? Well, I could try name is equal to name, and then Let's use a template literal here so we can put variables inside of this string. And this is going to take whatever name. So my name is Zephyr. And it says my name is Zephyr. Now that's great and all, but that sort of defeats the purpose of putting this particular method inside of this object. This could just be a regular function. So let's get rid of name. And instead, let's say we wanted to access this name up here. Well, how do we access that? name? Well, we could do person5 name. And as an example, let's go ahead and I'm going to show you that this works. Person5 name. And we can get rid of that because speak is no longer taking any parameters. And it says, my name is Caleb. So that works. That's nice. There's a better way of doing this though. We could do this dot name. And when we use this, it's referring to this entire object. So we don't need to have just name. We could put age, favorite food. We can have an object inside of an object inside of an object. We could have a function in there. We could do all sorts of things. But this is referring to this entire object, not any other object. It's just referring to this particular object. And so when I change this name to like Henry, and it's a name, so capital H, it says, my name is Henry. Now that's one example. We can also do this with functions. So let's go ahead and create a function. Counter. That's what we're going to call it, counter. And so functions also come with the this keyword. And so we can say, if this dot total is equal to undefined, because it doesn't exist, there's no counter dot total yet, we can say this dot total is equal to 1. Otherwise, if it is defined, and it will be defined after we run this at least once, we can say this dot total plus plus console.log running counter total is, and then we can say this dot total. Now, out of the box, this isn't going to do anything. What we want to do is execute this function. So this is going to execute it and say this dot total is 1. Running counter, this dot total is 1. What happens if we run this over and over and over and over again? I don't know how many times I copied and pasted that. It's going to let me know though. And this tracks how many times this function has been run. Now, you don't need to particularly count or track how many times this function was run. You could do anything. You could say, if this dot name is equal to undefined, set a default name. Now, what's not going to work, and what we're going to talk about in the next lesson is, I'm just going to copy a bunch of these, is an arrow function. And so I could do const counter is equal to an arrow function. And the this keyword, it exists, but not in the same manner. So when I go back here, you're going to see that this actually works. It says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's how many times I copied it, but it's not referring to this particular object or this function anymore. And we'll talk more about that in the next lesson or the next episode where we talk about arrow functions. An arrow function lets us write shorter code, but they can also seem a lot more complex. They're actually quite easy though, but if you're just looking at code and you've never really seen an arrow function, they seem super scary. They don't have to be though. And so we could write const hello is equal to a function, return hello Caleb, and then we could execute hello. So const greeting is equal to hello console.log greeting. And what we're going to see here, hello Caleb. That's a standard function. Actually, this is an anonymous function. We've assigned it to const hello. We can also do function hello, execute this function and store it in a different variable. Two ways of doing the exact same thing. When I refresh, it says the exact same thing. And so this is a typical function. So another way of writing this could be const hello is equal to brackets arrow and that. And so essentially what we've done here is function hello is equal to something like that. This is the old way of doing it. The new way of doing it is const hello brackets arrow console.log. Hello, hello. And we could type hello and execute it, and it's going to say, and it's going to say hello. Okay, that's one way of writing it. There's another way of writing it. We can actually make this a lot shorter. And in fact, we could simply do const hello is equal to opening and closing curly brace, not curly braces, but parentheses, an arrow. And then in a normal function, we use the return keyword. We use the return of the king keyword. And we don't need to do that. If this is going to be on a single line, we can just say this is going to execute some sort of function. And so this could say return hello from one line function. Let's go ahead and execute hello. And that's not going to do anything because I needed to console log it, but let's shortcut that and let's just run hello. And it returns. And so all this is doing some sort of logic. In this case, we're just returning a string and storing it in const hello. Then we can run it as if it were a function. Now let's look at some of the syntax here because I went kind of fast. So let's do const my new greeting. Classes are a lot like standard objects, but they're written in a more friendly way. In fact, you can think of this as two different ways to basically write the same set of code, and then classes can get significantly more advanced and more developer friendly, actually. So a class is really just another way of writing another object. And if that's the case, why have two ways of writing objects? If we have one way that works, why use a new way? And in modern JavaScript, you're going to see people using classes all the time. This is a very common thing these days. So while they are very similar, they being classes, have better features, like being able to write one class and merge it into another class with this thing called subclassing or extending. You can also write the same method twice and have it execute on both of them quite easily without overwriting them. And classes just look easier to read. Classes are also cleaner to write. You'll see a lot of these in production level code bases. Plus, they look a lot like PHP and Python classes, which means now at this point you're learning object-oriented programming, which means once you learn this lesson, you are basically getting experience learning Python, PHP, Java, C, all these other OOP languages you're getting hands-on experience with by learning it in JavaScript. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So a class starts with a keyword class, and then it has some sort of name. Now, often you'll see a class actually doesn't follow camel casing. It follows just normal casing. So it could be my class name, follows standard uppercase naming conventions like that. Not all the time, but you will see it a lot like this. And so you say my class name is equal to, well, it's not actually equal to anything because we're not assigning anything. We're saying my class name, curly braces, and then we can put object literals in here. So we could say something like speak console.log woof woof. And so this is the bare bones of a class. Now to instantiate a class, which is a fancy word for saying how to activate your class, you could say const thing, whatever you want to name it, is equal to new my class name. And we saw this in the date lesson where we did new date and then we put the year, month, and day. And at this point, we can say thing.speak. So at this point, this code right here looks a lot like a standard object. So let's go ahead and save this and refresh our page. And it says woof woof. And so what it's doing here is saying all this code, jam it into this particular variable, this const called thing. And because it has a method in here called speak, we can do thing.speak. Now, where this gets a little more powerful is we can do something like set name, and then it's going to take some sort of name, and we can say this.name is equal to the name. Now, this might seem a little weird, a little convoluted even, but what we're going to do here is use set name, set the name to whatever it is, and because we're using this, that stands for this entire object, that's what it represents, we can now say, in this particular method or this function speak, we can access it with this.name. And we can say woof woof says the dog named this.name. And this needs to be a template literal, otherwise we cannot use that. So now we can say thing dot set name doggo. And what that's going to do is set the name doggo. And so if we say create a new thing class, a new thing object, set that name, this.name is going to be whatever the name is in this parameter, so it's going to be doggo. And then we say thing.speak. We can now access this.name from set name. And there's actually an easier way to do this. We'll talk about this in the next lesson, but this is a good example of using the this keyword inside of a class. So let's go ahead and refresh, and it says woof woof says the dog named doggo. And so that's working perfectly. Now what happens if we don't set that name? Currently this.name does not exist. Let's go ahead and refresh our page. It says woof woof says the dog name undefined. Now if we wanted to, we could get into defaults. We could say something like if this.name is equal to undefined, this.name is equal to unnamed puppers. Let's save that and refresh. And it says woof woof says the dog named unnamed puppers. But if we go back here and we set thing.setName doggo McDogface, says woof woof says the dog named Doggo McDogface. And so what it's doing here is it's setting that name. It says this.name. Now, if that name wasn't set, it's saying if this name does not exist in this particular object, in this class, set it. Otherwise, it's going to be set because we use set name, it does exist. Then use that one. So this is a nice little fallback. You can always use something like this. Now there is a better way of doing this. We're going to learn it in the next lesson. What I would like you to do is basically this. I want you to write a brand new class, write it out by hand. Remember, in the last lesson, we used set name, but we can actually do this by default with a class method called a constructor. And this is a big feature and a big win for JavaScript classes. And we just don't get this with standard objects. And this is where classes start to outpace objects. So let's say we have a class and it's called person. And in the last lesson we did set name, name, this.name is equal to name, right? But then we had to do const p is equal to new person, and then we had to do p.setName Caleb. And that just, it gets easier. So like, why do it the hard way when we can do it the easy way? So let's go ahead and get rid of this and that, and that. And we have this magic method called constructor. And this can take any sort of parameter. So we could say the constructor takes a name, and then we say this.name is equal to name. And then we can have a normal function in here called greeting. This is an object literal, and we can simply say console.log hello from, and this is a template literal, so we use backticks, this.name. And what constructor does here is we can say const Caleb is equal to new person, and that name is going to be Caleb. And that's automatically going to set this name. So before we had to do .set name and we had to run a bunch of stuff. We don't have to do that anymore. We can just pass it in directly into our class. And now we can do Caleb.greeting, and this is already going to be set. This .name is equal to Caleb. So it's like putting Caleb in here, which then sets it here, which then sets it here. And this seems really absurd. I know that. When you're learning classes, this seems really bizarre, but it's powerful because you can write any number of functions down the road and you don't have to put name in here. You don't have to put name in every single one. You can just use this .name anywhere you want. So it shortcuts it. Let's save that. And let's refresh our page. And it says, hello from Caleb. What if I change that? Hello from Gully. Hello from Gully. Now, if we ever wanted to, and this is a little bit beyond the scope of the constructor lesson, but we could also say set name, and we could overwrite it. This .name is equal to whatever the name is. So let's, by default, set the name to be Gully, and then we could say Caleb.setName. I'm going to rename myself to Caleb, and do Caleb.greeting once more. And this is what my code looks like. I'll just scoot that up into the middle of the screen. And so when I refresh, it now says hello from Gully. I changed my name to Caleb, and when I reran Caleb.greeting, it said hello from Caleb. Now, what I would like you to do as your project or your little bit of homework for this lesson is create a class with a constructor method in it. It should take a name, or it could take multiple parameters. If you want it to take unlimited parameters, you can totally do that too. Set this dot whatever the variable name is, and you're going to see that when I select this, it's highlighted in all three methods here. But if you just set the name, make sure you also set it when you type new person, and then that first parameter is going to be name. If you have a second parameter, you would just give it a second param. And you'd need to do something with this, because this is not going to be accessible in any of these other methods. You're going to need to do this dot second param is equal to second param, and that just makes this accessible using the this keyword in everywhere else. So I'm just going to undo that because I want to keep this nice and simple for you. And I want you to give this a shot. So set the name here and then write another method, another function that accesses it from the constructor. This is really good practice. You're going to see this kind of stuff in production style JavaScript all the time in professional JavaScript, so make sure you are familiar with this. You don't have to. All right, welcome back. I hope you had some fun with classes. I hope that was actually a little bit hard, just so that your brain remembers it better. They're powerful, powerful things. They are better than objects. They can do so much more, and there is so much more, but we're not going to learn all about it in JavaScript 201 because it gets pretty advanced. But in this lesson, we're going to talk about JSON. And JSON, J-S-O-N, stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And it's basically just a thing some guy made up at some point in time, a long time ago, to make sure that one particular language can talk to another particular coding language. So JSON is a lightweight data interchange format. And that means I can write a particular type of JSON in JavaScript or in Python or in PHP, and it's going to be readable. And so even if my Node.js server can't talk to my Python server, I can send out JSON data that my Python server can then ingest, or it can take in and understand what's going on. So it's a globally recognized way to write code or to share data. So JSON is language independent. It doesn't really matter if it's JavaScript or Python or PHP or C or Java or Ruby or anything like that. And the idea behind JSON is it's supposed to be self-describing and easy to understand. Now, it's easiest to learn JSON by simply looking at it. So let's create a new file. Let's do a JavaScript file. And we're going to have some sort of object. So const object. And in here we could have name, Caleb. Fave foods is an array of pizza, tacos, I don't know, salmon. And we can have age, 31. And we can make this object even more complex. We could say children. And this could be an array of objects in here. Name is equal to Zephyr. He's actually a cat. And his age is going to be 4. And another one in here. This name is going to be Gully. He's also a cat. I'm not entirely sure what his age is. I'm going to guess 4 or 5. And so we have this object here. And this is written in JavaScript. Now, the nice thing about learning JavaScript first, or at this point in time when you're getting into JSON, is that JSON is literally this. Let's go ahead and delete that. This is JSON. And so this is JSON. This is all it is. It looks like a JavaScript object. And as we know, objects can hold a property or a key and a value, or it can have a property and that value could be an array, or a number, or a Boolean, or a list of more objects. This is all JavaScript is. And so whenever you're working with an API down the road, and for our main project here, we are going to be working with an API that uses JSON. It's going to look a lot like this. And the idea is that we have some sort of data in here that we can access on another computer. So if they want to share data with us, that's basically what an API is when another computer decides that they're going to share data with us. We can then use that data in a globally recognized and unified way. So we don't have to worry about XML and writing our code to make sure that it always works with specific XML. We can just assume that everything is working nicely with JSON. And so Python can consume this nicely, PHP can consume this nicely, Node.js can consume this nicely, and in JavaScript, which is what Node.js is built on, this is basically just a standard object. No big deal. We've already learned about all of these pieces. It's just, it doesn't have a variable. That's all it is. It's just plain text with a bunch of object data in it. And that is JSON. So when people say, oh, JSON is big and complex, they're wrong. It's not. It is literally just a JavaScript object. It just doesn't have a variable name. That's all it is. And so the idea here is that if I have this object, I can expose it on my web server. And let's talk about Ajax. Actually, it's not all caps anymore. It's just called Ajax. And so Ajax stands for asynchronous. Make sure I don't typo that. I'm not even sure if I did or didn't. JavaScript and XML. And so Ajax itself is actually not a programming language. Ajax is a combination of a browser's built-in XML HTTP request. So I'm saying XML HTTP request object. And that is the simplest way that your browser can send data to a server and accept data from a server. And so whenever you like a post, or whenever you like a photo on Instagram, or whenever you tweet something, or you're on Twitter and it automatically reloads your tweets for you, or you scroll down on Instagram and it just keeps on loading more and more images, that is an Ajax request. And so basically you can send this tiny amount of data to a server asking for more data. And that server can then send back usually a JSON object, which is what we learned about in the last lesson. And then JavaScript can parse that data, turn it into JavaScript objects or JavaScript arrays, and loop through the data in there and add more to your document object model, add more HTML to your page dynamically. And that is powerful because Now you don't need to reload your page. You don't need to click load more and wait for the page to load. You don't need to go to page 2 or page 3. You can just keep scrolling and it'll just keep loading more and more data for you. Assuming there's data to load, that is. Now the nice thing is it's super lightweight. Super lightweight. And that's because it only needs to send a tiny bit of data and only needs to accept a tiny bit of data. So when you make a standard web request, your browser is going to go to www.facebook.com and it's going to ask for all sorts of things. It's going to ask for a CSS file, it's going to ask for HTML, it's going to ask for JavaScript, it's going to ask for images, it's going to ask for all sorts of endless things. With an AJAX request, it is simply sending a small little request and saying, hey, psst, Facebook, can I have just a little bit more information? And then Facebook says, yeah, okay, you can have some more information through their API. And they send back JSON, or Instagram will send back JSON, or really most APIs these days will send back JSON. And instead of sending back CSS files, which you've already loaded, or HTML, which you can write dynamically with JavaScript, or even loading more JavaScript because it's already been loaded once, it can literally just send you the JSON data, just raw data. It doesn't need to give you all that extra stuff. And so it loads super fast. So we used to use these things called XML HTTP request objects to make these types of AJAX requests. But nowadays, we don't need to do that. We don't need to do that. We can just ignore that. And instead, we're going to use this thing called the fetch API, which makes it significantly easier. There's no try catch involved, which we used to have to write. We don't have to worry about dealing with Internet Explorer. We can just straight up use fetch. And that is the function that we're going to get into in the next lesson. All right, in the last 2 lessons, we learned about JSON and we learned about the fetch API and what AJAX is. And in this lesson, we're going to actually write a little bit of AJAX and we're going to get some information from a website. So we're going to use the fetch API, and that's because it's the new way of making AJAX requests. It handles things for us so that we don't need to, which is really nice. We don't have to write as much code, basically, and less code is always more. That's why we're not learning the old way of AJAX requests. It's old, it's outdated. We don't need to do it anymore. Instead, we're going to be learning fetch. So with fetch, it looks a lot like this. Fetch HTTP website.com does something, then does some more stuff in here, then does some more stuff in here. That's really all there is to a fetch request. And so we're saying, go and get information from website.com. Now we're going to use a proper example here, but this is what the syntax looks like. And you'll notice that I'm using an indent here because I don't necessarily want it to look like this. This looks a little harder to read. And because it's actually the then keyword or the then method is part of the fetch function, I'm going to indent it so it looks nicer so that I know when I'm reading fetch, the next line when it's indented is also part of this fetch. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up my browser and I'm going to go to swappy.dev. And this is where we can get some Star Wars information, just an API for Star Wars. There's another one. If you don't like Star Wars, you can do Pokemon API. And this is pokeapi.co. It's pretty much the exact same thing, slightly different URLs, but will give you very, very similar data. So if you're feeling like you'd rather do Pokemon stuff than Star Wars stuff, just swap out swappy.dev for pokeapi.co. The data is going to be slightly different. It's going to be structured slightly different. So you're going to have to handle that on your own, which is a good upgrade project, by the way. But for now, we're going to be using swappy.dev. And the idea here is that we can simply type in swappy.dev/API/planet minutes/3, and that's going to give us Yavin 4. Or people/1, and this is going to give us Luke Skywalker. And so we can actually go to this URL, and let's do this, API/people/1. And you can see it's giving us all sorts of information. Oh, there's links in here that we can't really see, but it's giving us all sorts of information. And if you take a look at this, doesn't this look a lot like JSON? Interesting, because it is JSON. And isn't it interesting that it already looks like a JavaScript object? That's amazing. We've got arrays in here. We've got an empty array. We've got regular strings. We have mass and height, which honestly should be numbers, but they are coming in as strings as well, which is totally fine. We can work with that. We know how to cast a string to a number and work with that as well. So we want to use this URL and get some information about our friend Luke Skywalker. So what I can do here is fetch, and I'm just going to paste that URL in here. Then I'm going to take that response and I'm going to JSONify it. So response.json, and this is using arrow functions. We're familiar with these. Already. This is a short way of writing a one-line arrow function. Then we can take that response and we can call it anything we want at this point. Let's just call it data. And let's go ahead and use a regular arrow function here and do console.log data. Now let's go back to our primary document and let's just refresh our console here. And this is a short way of writing a one-line arrow function. Then we can take that response and we can call it anything we want at this point. Let's just call it data. And let's go ahead and use a regular arrow function here and do console.log data. Now let's go back to our primary document and let's just refresh our console here. And you can see it takes a second to kick in there. It's not as fast as it usually is, and that's because it's asking another server for information. But it is still pretty fast. And so we now have this object in here that has the birth year, eye color, hair color, name, starships, vehicles, even has all the films that he's in, which are more API. Links, which we could go and get information from. This is how we make a simple fetch request. So what I would, because it's asking another server for information. Now let's go back to our primary document and let's just refresh our console here. And you can see it takes a second to kick in there. It's not as fast as it usually is, and that's because it's asking another server for information. But it is still pretty fast. And so we now have this object in here, data. Now let's go back to our primary document and let's just refresh our console here. You see, it takes a second to kick in there. It's not as fast as it usually is, and that's because it's asking another server for information. But it is still pretty fast. And so we now have this object in here that has the birth year, eye color, hair color, name, starships, vehicles. It even has all the films that he's in, which are more API links, which we could go and get information from. This is how we make a simple fetch request. So what I would like you to do is create a simple fetch request. Now you can use the Star Wars API, or you can use the Pokemon API, or you can use really any other API as long as you have access to that JSON. And just remember, we're going to fetch that URL. We're then going to take that response and turn it into JSON with response.json. Then we're going to take that data, which is basically the response.json. We're going to take that data and we're going to console log that data. And that's all we're going to do at this point in time. Once you have that console logging in your console, let's head on over to our final project, where we create a way for our page to randomly load a character from swappy.dev. And this is going to be our final project. So make sure you have a few minutes lined up. Make sure you've got welcome to your final project. Your project here is to create a page that randomly selects a Star Wars or Pokemon character and displays some of their information. Okay, it's going to need to get random character information. So you're going to need a button that says like randomize or instructions, like you need some sort of button with an event listener to write some of the code. The number 8. If I'm doing Caleb, and so ever you can /em. And so whenever I click that randomize button, my way is probably not the most efficient way. Whatever it looks like, even if it's just bare bones like this, I want you to be able to share your source code. So you can even put it on Git if you know Git. But if you don't know Git, you can use CodePen. Welcome to Bootstrap 101, and in this course, as mentioned in the introduction video, we're going to be learning Bootstrap by reading the documentation, which is extremely important. So whenever you use a new API or a new service and you have a question, the first place you want to look is the documentation. And a lot of times, people don't do that. They ask their friends, they ask their mentors, they ask Facebook groups, and really the best place to ask any question is always the documentation first. Always go to the docs first. And so in this course, this is what we're going to be doing, is we're going to be learning Bootstrap by experimenting with the documentation. And the reason we're doing that specifically with Bootstrap is because the Bootstrap docs are really, really good. Now, before we get started, one thing to take note of here is that we are using Bootstrap 5 Beta 1. So in the future, let's say we get to Bootstrap 5.3 and something has changed a little bit. Again, this is why we're learning how to read docs, is because sometimes when someone records a video, like a teacher such as me records a video about, let's say, CSS or JavaScript or Bootstrap, and technology changes pretty rapidly, you might want to be able to reference the documentation and figure out exactly what has changed. Now, I don't foresee a lot of changes happening with Bootstrap 5 coming out of Beta 1 and going into proper version. Now, if anything does change between Beta 1 and let's say 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, anything major, you'll be completely prepared. And this module, this Bootstrap 101 module, is all about teaching you how to be prepared while learning Bootstrap. So let's head on over to getbootstrap.com and let's go over to the docs. And this stands for documentation. Now, the first thing you want to look at is basically the introduction, the installation rules in the documentation. This is going to help you get set up with any sort of project in the future. future, not just Bootstrap, but any project out there. So we're going to be using getbootstrap.com for a lot of what we're going to be learning in this module. So make sure you have internet access and that you can go to getbootstrap.com. Okay, let's get started with Bootstrap. So first thing I did was I went to getbootstrap.com and clicked on the docs. Your page might look a little bit different from mine. I'm zoomed in so that this looks, half decent in a video, especially if you're watching this on like a tablet or a phone. At least you can see it, hopefully. Whereas the site usually on my computer looks like this. So I'm just zoomed in a little bit here. And if I click over to the docs, we can see we can get started. There's customization, layout, content, forms, components, helpers, utilities, extend, and about, plus migration from older versions of Bootstrap. Now, if you're already familiar with Bootstrap, let's say Bootstrap 3, Bootstrap 4, and you want to start learning Bootstrap 5, dive right into the docs and go straight to the migration area. The migration area is going to tell you basically what's changed and how to basically write modern Bootstrap. But this lesson is not about migration. This lesson is about getting started. So let's click getting started and go into introduction. Now what we want to do here is read through this. Now I'm not going to just read through this because you can read through this on your own. You're a fully capable human being and I know you know how to do that. But let's go through the introduction steps anyway. I'm just not going to read this verbatim because that's going to be super boring for you. So first things first, let's go to the quick start and we need CSS. So what Bootstrap is basically this library that lets you do a lot of things with CSS and a little bit of JavaScript, and you don't have to write all of your own CSS and JavaScript. It's pre-compiled, it's pre-made for you. You just need to learn the rules of this. And this is called a library or a framework. So the first thing you need to do for your project is copy this. And yours might not say 5.0.0-beta1, yours might say something different. But basically you just want to copy that link and you want to put that into your HTML in your head. And there's an example on this page I'll show you in just a little bit. So you're going to want to make sure you have that. And if you're not using any JavaScript, you don't need to add any JavaScript. But if you are going to use JavaScript, such as like a modal, a little pop-up window inside of your page, then you're going to need to add some JavaScript. And for that, we just want to go in here and copy this stuff, the separate part. And you're going to want Popper.js and Bootstrap 5. Again, that version might be a little bit different. This version here, Core 2.5.4, might be a little bit different for you depending on the time that you're watching this video. But regardless, you can just copy that and that's going to put it in your clipboard and you can paste that into your project at any point in time. So in these docs, there's a lot of different things that we are going to skip over. So like Sass, which is a way to compile your CSS. We're not going to get into that just because this is more of a Bootstrap course and less of a Sass course. So if we go down, we can see that there's an example here. Doc type HTML, that's HTML5. We put the CSS in our head element. We should be familiar with that already. And our JavaScript always goes at the bottom of our body. So we put our content in here and we put our JavaScript down here. And the reason we do that is because we want our browser, which loads things from top to bottom, to load all of our HTML content as much as possible anyways, and then load our JavaScript. And the reason for that is because JavaScript, if it gets initiated too early, and let's say it's looking for this H1, it might not find it because the browser hasn't loaded it yet. Now, that's not really a problem with modern internet, with fast internet, but if you're in a place with slow internet, or if you're on a phone with slow internet, that could be a problem. So we always put our JavaScript at the very bottom of our page, or those two that we were looking at earlier, we would put them at the very bottom here. This is just in an HTML comment. Just make sure you don't put it in an HTML comment, just like this. There is a second way to do this, but before we even move on to the download instructions, let's go ahead and take a look at the responsive meta. So you need this, absolutely you need this. This is what's going to make your page responsive. If your page isn't responsive, there's no point using Bootstrap. And what responsive means, basically, is that it's going to snap to look different on either a mobile, like a phone, tablet, a laptop, desktop, TV, etc., etc. So it's going to be completely responsive. So you could have something that takes up this entire width on a large screen like my laptop here, or it could snap into like two different rows. Instead of just one big row, we see one row here. It could snap into two different rows using a phone, for instance. And that just makes it so that you can scroll a little bit easier on a phone and you don't have to scroll left and right. And it just looks better that way. Now there's a bunch of things in here like box sizing, which we don't have to go into. If you want to, you can definitely read through it. If you want to get really good at Bootstrap, honestly, just read through the docs. It shouldn't take very long. You could probably read through everything in this documentation in about an hour or two on your own. It's a little bit dry, so I'm going to skip through some of the dry stuff and just get you up and running quickly. Now, I mentioned that there's a second way to basically get Bootstrap up and running, and that's to download it. You can download the CSS and the JavaScript, and you can host it yourself. Or what I like to do is use a CDN, so a content delivery network. And a content delivery network basically allows you to host this on your website, or not host it on your website, but to serve it from your website. And the nice thing about this is if someone has already downloaded this from another website, they don't have to re-download it on your website. So it's going to load even quicker. And with a content delivery network, even if they haven't downloaded it before from another website, if their browser hasn't downloaded it before from another website, it's going to get the closest location. So if your server is in, let's say, the United Kingdom, but you are in America, instead of having to make this request, so basically you're downloading this file from the UK all the way down to the United States, instead of having to do that traveling, it could find a content delivery network or basically a mainframe that's closer to you. So it could go from, let's say you're in Seattle, it could find one in San Francisco, rather than having to cross halfway across the globe and download it, send it all the way through the internet wires. It just saves a lot of time. So you can go from Seattle to San Francisco, and it's significantly faster. So that's a benefit of using a CDN. Now, if you want to get into customization, you're going to want to download this on your own and host it on your own. We're not going to get into too much customization at this point in time. Now, there's a bunch of other stuff in here. I'm going to quickly go through some of it. Maybe actually not. Let's not go through some of it, just because this gets a little more advanced and gets into customization. And again, we're not customizing Bootstrap at this point in time. We're learning how to use Bootstrap and how to read docs. One thing you are going to see a lot of is RTL. That's right to left. So in some languages, they write their language from right to left. We go from left to right, so it goes this way. In some languages, they go the other way, and so there's RTL support. By default, everything is left to right, LTR, left to right, but you can, if you wanted to, switch that to right to left if your language needs it to be from right to left. If you're already familiar with Webpack, you can use Webpack, you can install Webpack, and you can install Bootstrap using Node and NPM. You can do all sorts of stuff with it. It's completely customizable. Everything you see here can be changed. jQuery is how we write one form of JavaScript and have it execute perfectly on all browsers. This is helpful because browsers don't implement JavaScript the same way. Some have different rules. Some don't trust certain features that you make, and they make you write different code for different browsers. jQuery bridges that gap, meaning you can write JavaScript for all browsers, and it will always just work. You don't have to deal with different browser support whatsoever. jQuery is also considered a library. It's not a framework, meaning you're allowed to mix your normal JavaScript with it and nothing bad could happen. And there aren't strict ways to write your JavaScript with jQuery, whereas with a framework such as Vue.js or React.js, there are certain rules you want to follow, and there's a lot of magic behind the scenes that you don't see, which makes learning other frameworks like React a little bit harder. Starting in about 2019, React.js and Vue.js became very popular, and people now say things like, oh, don't bother learning jQuery, but it's literally used on millions and millions and millions of websites. So why wouldn't you learn a skill that's so clearly in demand? And the nice thing is you can learn jQuery in a single day. Learning React.js or Vue.js is going to take a long time because they're such big frameworks. They're powerful too, but if you just need a little assistance with your JavaScript or you simply want to write less code, then jQuery is 100% for you. And truthfully, from a senior developer's perspective, you don't need to learn jQuery or React or Vue. You can do it all with vanilla or plain JavaScript, but these tools help us do more with less code. Furthermore, and again, this is a truth bomb, using React.js or Vue.js on about 95% of all websites is complete overkill. You'll end up spending too much time writing React for a small feature that can be written with jQuery in a matter of minutes, sometimes a matter of seconds. That's why I choose to write vanilla JavaScript or jQuery on most of my websites, unless there's a real need for something big and complex. Then I tend to choose React or Vue. So the reason that you should be learning jQuery is because simply market demand. Hundreds of millions of websites are using it. You might as well learn what is in demand. Hello and welcome to or we can use this thing called a using jQuery. If we want to put JavaScript at loaded again, we are going to be all right, when we're talking about jQuery syntax, it's a lot like JavaScript syntax. It is actually, it's just all written in JavaScript. It's just a certain way to write our JavaScript. And so in our last lesson, we wrote this weird document.ready function thing. So let's break this down a little bit. So that's where we're going to be putting all of our code in every lesson moving forward when we're talking about jQuery. But the syntax here, the style in which it's written, looks a lot like this. So we've got a $ with parentheses, and this is our selector. And so if you come from JavaScript, this is a lot like the document.querySelector method. The only difference is we don't have to write this anymore. We can simply write a .div in here, and that's going to select it for us. So it's a nice little shortcut. So in here we have a selector. Then we have some sort of function or event or method or something happens with this selector. And so we see up here, we see ready. So we've selected document, and we're going to say when it's ready. Or when we have a button, we can say on click, or we can do something. So there's some sort of event that happens here. And this by itself is just a method or a function. And then it takes this thing called a callback function. And most things in jQuery take a callback function. So it's going to do a thing. So it's going to select something in your page. It's going to then execute or register some sort of event. And then when that event is happening, what do we do? And this is where we wrap it in a function. So this is just an anonymous function. And this just makes sure that everything stays scoped in here. So it's a nice way to make sure that your variables don't leak out of this particular area. Now in our body up here, let's say we have h1.custom class name with an ID of custom ID. And so you can actually see how I wrote that. If I just undo that, you can see I wrote h1.custom class name ID custom ID. And this is exactly like writing CSS. So if you know CSS already, this is going to be incredibly easy for you. This is regular CSS. And it just happens to be that VS Code has this thing called an emit abbreviation. So you can write your CSS and just simply hit tab and it will create your element for you. So we can say in here, hello world. And now with our selector, and let's go ahead and create a new example here. In the last lesson, we did the document.ready function, yada yada. We can use semicolons. We don't have to use semicolons. It's regular JavaScript, so regular JavaScript rules still apply. And we can use a selector in here. So we can select this h1 like this, and we can do a thing here. And that's going to select this h1. We can also say .custom class name, and that's going to select this h1, along with any other element that has this class name. Or if we wanted to get something completely unique, we could do ID custom ID. And again, this is just regular CSS. And so when we're writing CSS, this is exactly how we write it anyways. This is how we create a custom declaration using a CSS selector. And so in jQuery, we do the exact same thing. And in modern JavaScript, we do the exact same thing. So we have several different ways We could even get really specific and say grab all H1s with a custom class name. And let's say text is going to be change me. And we're jumping the gun here a little bit. And we're going to learn about text down the road, but I want to show you that this is an example. So what this is going to do is select this element up here, and then it's going to take that text and change it from hello world, which we know it's going to render hello world in big letters, and it's going to say change me. Or let's change it to this was changed via jQuery. Let's save that, refresh our page. And it says this was changed via jQuery. But if I refresh fast enough, you can see that it flickers. And so if I right click and view my source, let's make that just a wee bit bigger, we can see that it actually says hello world. So when the page renders, it's saying hello world in here. But once jQuery is loaded, it changes it to this was changed via jQuery. Now that is pretty much all the syntax we need to know right now. There's a little Before we get started, let's take a quick peek at what React.js is. So if you head on over to reactjs.org, you can actually see they have tutorials and they have all sorts of stuff on here. It's actually a really, really good site, and I suggest and I highly recommend that you get a little bit familiar with it over your time learning React. But what is React? React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. Okay, that's somewhat helpful. That's a pretty good statement about what React is. But what React actually is, you know how a website is made out of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then usually some backend language for data processing. React allows you to build interactive websites. So HTML and CSS can't do that. It can't be super interactive, but React can make it reactive, can make it fun and engaging, and that's what React does. Now, React comes with an interesting syntax called JSX. It's not just JavaScript. It looks like JavaScript mixed with some crazy version of HTML. And we're going to get into that in just a little bit. But basically, what you need to know in this particular lesson is, all right, let's go ahead and download and install Node. We need this thing called Node.js. So let's type into Google, download Node.js. And this is going to bring us to nodejs.org/download. So if it brings you to the home page, you can just click on the download icon here, or I guess it's not an icon, it's a button. Go with LTS, that's long-term support. That means they're not trying new things. That means that Node 14 or Node 16 is going to be supported for a long period of time. The all steps, and next up all right, let's go ahead and start a new project. I'm just going to make this. And what this is going to do is go ahead and install Create React App globally on your computer. And so you can see that that was very fast for me. It might take a little bit longer for you. As this is built to get all the JavaScript libraries it needs, it's going to install all of them. It's going to apparently install Yarn so that it can download things using Yarn instead of NPM. It's just a little bit faster. It's another package manager. Really, we don't need to worry about that. I'm pretty sure this is going to remove Yarn. Yeah, it did. It removed Yarn. And then it says all sorts of things that we can pretty much ignore at this point. We can either cd md yarn.lock npm. Okay, let's take a look at React app.js. And this looks really, really, really bizarre. I'm going to make this even just a touch smaller there because we don't need the terminal for this lesson. And this looks really bizarre. So if you're used to just writing vanilla JavaScript, you might have never even seen an import command before. This might be brand new to you. And if that is brand new to you, that's okay. We will talk about that. We'll get a little bit of experience with that as well. We see a function which looks just like a regular function in JavaScript, and a return statement with an opening parentheses. And if we go down here, there's a closing parentheses that matches it. You can see this line highlights up here. And then we have a div. Now this looks weird because we're not using a string. We're not using a template literal in JavaScript. We are using straight HTML. And in fact, this actually gets a little bit weirder just because we're not just using HTML, we're using this thing called JSX, which is basically XHTML. So it's HTML similar to normal HTML5, but it's written inside of our JavaScript, which is pretty nuts to see. So if this is your first time looking at this and you're like, whoa, I either don't like this or I have no idea what's going on, bear with me for a little bit. It gets a lot easier and it gets pretty nice to work with down the road. So let's just read through this line by line. We have a div, and notice that it's not class. Class is an actual name in JavaScript. It's a keyword. We can't use that. So we use class name is equal to app. We see the same thing here and here. We have an image. Its src is, well, this looks a little bit bizarre. So instead of a file like logo.svg, we've imported logo.svg. So let's go and open this file. It's just a regular SVG file. We've imported that as a variable called logo. Whenever we use one of these in React, we say the attribute name or the property name is equal to, and instead of having quotation marks on either side, like we usually do in HTML, we have curly brackets, an opening curly bracket and a closing curly bracket. And then we put that variable. And so that is one little quirk. All right, let's take a look at importing components in it is a standard S. We can use class name is equal to.
All right, so in this project, we're going to build some expanding cards. Basically, we're going to style these panels to have a background. All right, so expand active thing, and then add a little bit of JavaScript so that when we click one of these, it changes the class to active, and it then expands with a CSS transition. Okay, so we'll be using JavaScript for the event listeners. We'll be using CSS transitions to give it the smooth effect. You'll see the heading doesn't come in until the card is fully expanded as well. And we're using just background images and headings, but you could make these into testimonials or FAQs or whatever it might be. So hopefully you enjoy it. Let's go ahead and jump in and get started. All right, so in this video, we're going to do the absolute panel equals on the bottom, which is the small here, and then nth dash of dash cards expands. And okay, so now we want to get into the JavaScript, which is actually going to be fairly simple. And I plan on this being one of the first projects, at least in the first 10. So I'm going to explain kind of stuff that many of you might already know. Now, remember that the whole thing, what we need to do is just change the class really on each of these. So the first one has a class of active right now. If I put that class on the second one just manually by typing it in here, it's going to show the second one. So I'm going to start with that on the first like I had, but we want to be able to switch that in our JavaScript. So we need to first bring in all of these panels into our JavaScript files. So I'm going to create a variable called panels, and there's different ways to select elements. We can use, get element by ID. We can use query selector. So what query selector does is allows us to select anything. It could be, a paragraph, an H1, a class, an ID, whatever. We want the panels, which have a class of panel. Now the problem here is there's more than one panel, right? We have all these divs with panels, so we can't just do this or it's just going to select the first one. So we need to use query selector all in that case. And with query selector all, instead of just selecting the element directly, it puts all of the panels into what's called a node list, which is similar to an array. In fact, I can show you that. If I console log here panels, and we open up our Chrome DevTools here, you'll see that it prints out this node list with each div and some properties. and I can target specific panels. Like if I put 0 in here, because arrays are 0 index, it's going to give me the very first panel. You can see it has the class of active. So I could get the second one with 1, and so on. Now you can also loop through a node list just like you can with an array, and that's what I want to do. I want to take my panels and use a for each, which is a high order array method, and these methods take in a function as an argument. So you could do function, or what you usually see is an arrow function like this. Okay, and then we need to pass in here whatever we want to use for each iteration. These are panels, so I'm going to use panel, singular. And I can console log here, panel, and it's just going to loop through and show me each panel. Now, what do we actually want to do here? We want to have an event listener on each of these so that if we click it, something happens. So we'll take each panel and say add event listener, and I want to listen for a click. And when that click happens, we're going to run a function. And for that function, let's just do a console log here, and I'll just say, I don't know, 1, 2, 3. And if I click on any of these, we're going to log 1, 2, 3. So I want to, whatever one we click on, I want to add a class of active. So if I say panel.classList, that gives me a list of the classes. But we also have methods on this class list object like add, where we can specifically add a class, and I'm going to add a class of active. So now, let me just close this. If I click on this one, it gets added the class of active, which then changes it to flex5. If I click on this one, same thing, but you can see that active is typically add a class, and I'm going to add a class of active. So now, let me just close this. If I click on this one, it gets added the class of active, which then changes it. So I'm going to have a function
so we have to move along. So now that we have those separated, notice when we hover over with our mouse button, usually you wouldn't use this, like most people who are on a desktop wouldn't have their screen like this, but some might. And it's nice to have a little visual indicator that you're hovering over it where your cursor pointer changes to a little hand icon. So what we can do is we can say, oh, and by the way, I messed up. These two elements should be nested. Get element by ID mobile-CTA. This basically, so position fixed when we scroll, notice how it stays up on top of here all the time. That's what position fix, one of the things position fix does. We're also going to put z index 999, a really high value. Z index, when you can place onto elements that have position absolute or position fixed. A really high z index means it's going to sit on top of everything, because we want this menu to sit on top of everything. Next up is going to be width. We're going to do 66%. We're also going to put right 0, so it's going to push that whole area over there to the right. Top is going to also be 0, meaning it's going to be the very top of the document. Background is going to be our dark color that we used for the features section. So notice now we can start to see it come alive, essentially. Height is going to be 100 viewport height. A VH is another one of those relative. Us to add a CSS class that will toggle on that display at the end. And we have 3 different, instead of using hyphens, you use camel case. So we're going to mobile btn here in JavaScript equals document dot get element by ID mobile hyphen CTA. This basically allows us to, in the future, reference the button right here, because if we look at it, we have the ID of mobile CTA. That's how we get it in JavaScript. Now, we take off the semicolon. We don't have to put const again. We can just define a bunch of them, like nav equals document dot query selector nav. So you use get element by ID for elements that have an ID attribute, or if you just want to select an element name like div or whatever or label, you can just put the actual element name. So instead of get element ID, it's query selector. There's only one nav, so we just choose nav. Then one more, and that's going to be mobile btn exit. That's going to be that white X button. And it has an ID of mobile exit. So now we put the semicolon at the end, and we have 3 different properties or variables that we can now access. So we say mobile btn. We're going to add an event listener of a click type. There's a bunch of different type of event listeners, like when mouse hover, like when the mouse moves over it or whatever. This is a click, or when somebody taps it. We open this up into here. So this is the first parameter. This is an arrow function. I'm not going to really bother explaining if you're brand new to JavaScript. But basically, what this means is when somebody clicks on that button right here, do whatever is inside of these squiggly brackets, okay? So what do we want to happen? Well, we want to take our navigation right here, which is currently hidden with display none, and we want to attach a class that will change it to display block. All right, so to do that, we say nav, which is defined right here. Dot class list dot add, because we want to add one, menu hyphen btn. Now menu hyphen btn, I believe we don't yet have defined. Let me see if we do. Control F to find. Yeah, there it is. Nav, we already defined it. Display block. So that's the purpose. JavaScript's going to add that when this gets clicked. So if we hit save, click, there it is. All right, so you can just put the actual element name. So instead of get element ID, it's query selector. There's only one nav, so we just choose nav. Then one more, and that's going to be mobile btn exit. That's going to be that white X button. And it has an ID of mobile exit. So now
Okay, so in this project we're going to be building a blurry loading page or loading image. So if I come to this page here, you'll see that the image starts blurred, and we also start with 0%, and then that goes up to 100%, and the image comes into focus. So you could use this to load just about anything. We're just doing a blur effect on the image, but you could load in your site. You could have any other elements in the DOM load in that specific amount of time from when we go to 0 to 100. And we'll have to map different number ranges to the 0 to 100 load. For instance, the image blur is going to be 30 pixels when it starts, and it's going to go down to 0 as we go from 0 to 100. And there's a Stack Overflow function that we're going to use to help us do that, to help us map one number range to another. All right, so that's it. Let's get started. So we're going to get started on the blurry loading project, and the HTML is going to be really simple. There's actually only 2 lines in the body, but let's add a title here. So we'll call this blurry loading, and then down here let's get rid of the H1, and this is going to be a section. I'm going to give this a class of BG. So this is going to be the background image that we blur, and then we'll have around the text we'll have a class of loading dash text, and we just want to put in here 0%, and that should do it as far as the HTML goes. So let's jump into our style sheet, and there's not too much we have to do here either. I'm going to change the font, so I just want this to be googleapis.com/CSS, and we want to use a font family. I'm going to use a family of Ubuntu, if I can spell family correctly. And then let's change down here, change Roboto to Ubuntu. And then this stuff can really all stay the same. We don't have to change anything here. We don't need flex direction column, but it's not going to hurt if you do leave it. Now for the background, remember we have that section with the class of BG, and we want to set a background. Actually, let's just use the background property and say we want this to be a URL, and the actual image that I'm going to use, I'm just going to copy and paste in. Of course, you can use any image you want. If you want to use this one, you can get it from the link from the repository. So let's make this have no repeat. Let's make it center on the X and Y axis, and cover for the background position. And we want to position this absolute. And then let's set the top. So I'm going to initially just set the top in left to 0. I'm going to change this, and I'll show you why in a couple minutes. And then the width, we'll set that to 100 viewport widths, and the height to 100 viewport height. So we just wanted to take up the whole viewport. And let's add a Z index here of -1, because we want this to be behind the 0%, or whatever the percentage is, the text. And we want to add a filter here, and initially the blur is going to be set to 0 pixels. And then for the loading text, we just want to increase the font size. Let's set that, we'll set the font size to 50 pixels, and let's set the color to white. Really depends on the background image you use. Alright, so that gives us this. Now I just want to show you something. Because this is going to start blurry, and then it's going to make its way up, or make its way down, I should say. The higher the pixels for the blur, the more blurry it is. So if I put like 70 pixels in here, that's what it looks like. Now notice on the edges, this comes out quite a bit. So I actually want to fix that. I don't want it to come out that much. So for the top and left, I'm going to set that to negative 30 pixels. And let's also set the left to negative 30 pixels. Now if I do that, you're going to see there's less spacing on the left and the top, but there's more over here. So for the width and the height, what we can do is calculate. So we can use calc and just wrap this, and we just want to add 60 pixels like that, and now you can see that it's even on the left and right. We want to do the same for the top and bottom, so we'll do the same thing. We'll just calc, and we want to add 60 pixels here as well, and now there's not as much space. All right, so I think that that looks a little better. So let's put this back to 0 pixels. So in the next video, we want to add our JavaScript so that we can have this image basically start blurry and then have it work its way up to being clear as this percentage loads here. So now we want to work on actually having this percentage change. So we want it to go from 0 to 100, and then the background image is going to start blurry, and then it's going to go to clear as this loads. So first thing, we'll just bring in the two elements we have, which are the load text. So let's say document dot query selector, query selector, and we have a class of text, or what we call loading text. And then we also want the background, so that has a class of BG, and we'll just call this BG. Okay, now I'm going to initialize a value here called load, which is going to start at 0. Obviously, it's going to go from 0 to 100. And we're going to have a function here called blurring. And right now, I just want to take that load value and increment it by 1. And then I'm going to go ahead and just console log load. Now, the way we want to run this function is in an interval, and I want it to run every 30 milliseconds. So let's create a variable here called int. So we'll say let int and set this to set interval, and the function we want to run is the blurring function, and let's say every 30 milliseconds. Okay, this is not 30 seconds, this is 30 milliseconds, which is very quick. So I'm going to save this, and if we go and we open up our dev tools here and we go to the console, you're going to see it's just going to go from 0 and it's going to increment every 30 milliseconds forever. It's just going to keep going. Obviously we don't want that. We want it to go from 0 to 100. So what we'll do here, actually I'll leave the console log for now, and let's say if the load value is greater than 99, then we want to stop that interval, and the way we do that is with the clear interval function. So we want to pass in int because that represents this set interval. So now if I save that, when it gets to 100, it should stop. Okay, so that's what we want. Now instead of just console logging, obviously we have some stuff in the DOM that we want to work with, that we want to change. One is going to be the text. So let's take the load text and set the inner text value. And I'm going to set that to, let's use some template string here, and we want the load, okay, whatever that is at the time, and then just a percentage sign. So if I save that, you'll see that this will start counting up to 100. If I save that, when it gets to 100, it should stop their interval function. So we want to pass in int because that represents this set interval. So now if I save that, when it gets to 100, it should stop. Okay, so that's what we want. Now instead of just console logging, obviously we have some stuff in the DOM that we want to work with, that we want to change. One is going to be the text. So let's take the load text and set the inner text value. And I'm going to set that to, let's use some template string here, and we want the load, okay, whatever that is at the time, and then just a percentage sign. So if I save that, you'll see that this will start counting up to 100. And also the way that I want this to show is not only count up to 100, but it's going to start fully opaque, and then it's going to start to fade out as it loads up. All right, so what we'll do is take the load text and set the opacity. So let's say style.opacity. Opacity. And this is going to be tricky because the opacity value isn't going to be the load value, because that goes from 0 to 100. Opacity goes from 0 to 1, right? So it's going to start at, or actually in our case we want it to start full, you know, fully opaque, so 1, and we want it to go to 0. So we have to map a range of numbers, that's basically 0 to 100, to going from 1 to 0 in the same amount of time. Now there's actually a Stack Overflow post that we're going to use here to reference. And this person asks either in JavaScript or jQuery to map a range of numbers to another range of numbers, because that's what we want to do. We want to map 0 to 100 to 1 to 0 for the opacity. And this is the question here, but the answer that I want to show you is this one here. So it's pretty simple.
All right, let's take a look at some of the utilities here. Let's just get started with this. So I'm on getbootstrap.com. I go over to docs. We already dealt with the getting started, how to get that up and running in your project. Let's go ahead and jump straight to utilities. And there's an API in here. Let's read this API. Now, some of this may or may not be completely applicable to us at this point in time, and that depends on your skill level. So when you see a $ like this is usually a SAS, or SCSS, SASS, you see that here, SASS. It's a way to compile CSS, and so that we can basically have programming inside of CSS, which CSS doesn't come with for the most part. There's all sorts of stuff in here. Here's a good example. Utilities, opacity, you can change that opacity, you can change the property value, and the values can be different things in here. Again, we're not going to get too far into customization, but this is really good to know when you get really advanced with Bootstrap. And, you know, if you work for an agency down the road, you're going to be customizing Bootstrap like this. But again, that's a subject for another day. You don't have to worry about that right now. So moving forward, we're going to see these things called utilities. And utility is basically just CSS. So it says like opacity -0, and that's going to make an element completely see-through, or opacity 75, and it's going to be 75% visible. That means it's going to be 25% see-through, and we see that with opacity -75 or opacity -50. We could add more in here if we wanted to customize it. Again, we're not going to customize, but you can customize it. So if your project needed opacity 90%, you could just add another item in here in your JavaScript, in your values. And just under the 75 here, you could put 90:0.9, and that will give you opacity -90. And this is more about the, here we go. This is more about the API. So if you wanted to customize, again, and I can't stress this enough, we're not going to get into customization because that's a whole new can of worms, and that's a completely different subject. But if we wanted to, we could change it from opacity, which is what we saw up here, to just the letter O. And if we come up here, we can actually see that by default it's just opacity, but we could change that class name to O, and it's just going to output O-0, so opacity 0, or O-100, opacity is 1. There's different states and stuff in here. Let's talk about borders. So sometimes you want to add a border to things in your page just to make them look nice. For instance, this navigation bar up here has a bottom border. It's very, very thin, but it gives it that nice little separation. So you know that there's this nav bar with search in here that floats down the page with you. Now to add a border, first of all, there's additive and there's subtractive. So additive borders are basically you have a span here like this and you just add a border. Or if you just want top or like this nav bar up here, just border bottom. And you can see these very plainly. So there's 5 instances here and there's 5 pieces of border bottom. Thing with border end, border bottom, and border start, border secondary. Let's type in our filter here, border color. And this is that changes it to black. Let's have some fun with this. So we have this image in here. And this is an SV border 0 rounded -1 round. Okay, let's talk about colors. This is very important because if you want a site that doesn't look plain and boring, you want some colors. Like Bootstrap uses this nice purple. So let's go down, and while we're reading docs, we always want to read these fun little things that stick out like this. Dealing with specificity. Sometimes contextual classes cannot be applied due to the specificity of another selector. Now what that means is sometimes you can't add a particular class because another class is going to overwrite.
How's it going, guys? My name is Dom, and
Hey guys, welcome to another crash course. Today we're going to be looking at Twitter Bootstrap, which is a front-end framework. Now, before my longtime subscribers start complaining, asking why the hell is he doing a tutorial on Bootstrap, let me just say that I'm starting to add videos to my channel for beginners. I just did
Hey guys, it's David from mdbootstrap.com, and in this crash course I'm gonna teach you how to use Bootstrap 5 and what the new features you can find in this newest version of the most popular front-end framework built to design modern, responsive and dynamic web pages and web applications. But before we start, I would like to make a short note here, as Bootstrap 5 is currently in alpha version. So at the time you might be watching this video, there might be already a beta or even a stable version released, which might have some changes in the syntax. So please do check the description down below in this video, because if there was an important update, I'm gonna update this tutorial, and I'm gonna link the new version to the updated tutorial in the description. However, I don't really expect crucial changes to happen, so I think this tutorial will be still valid also for the stable release. So if you have any sort of interest in web development, you've likely heard of Bootstrap. If you haven't heard of it before, Bootstrap is the most popular HTML, CSS and JavaScript framework for developing responsive mobile first project on the web. Bootstrap has been around for more than 8 years already, and its most popular CSS framework, as I said. It powers roughly around 18 million websites worldwide, and these numbers are still growing. So if you are or you want to be web developer, this is definitely something you should get familiar with. So why should you use Bootstrap? So obviously it increases development speed, so you could write all those classes by yourself, but why would you waste a few months of your time to create something which is already available for you? And furthermore, it's been tested and verified by other users. As I mentioned, there are like 80 million pages, so a lot of users use that. So it's already been tested and verified, and there is any error, it's already being raised and fixed very quickly because the community is really huge. Now, Bootstrap was made to create a mobile first. Its approach is mobile first, so which means it's designed to create and assure the responsiveness of your website. Using Bootstrap as other frameworks basically also prevent you from repetition in your code between the projects, so you can just reuse the same elements in different projects, and that's which makes your project more consistent. What is also important is that Bootstrap is being tested against all modern web browsers, so when you are using this Bootstrap components, they are already tested against new web browsers, so you are kind of sure that they're gonna work and those elements are gonna work on each and every web browser. And as I mentioned before, it has a really large community, so in case of any issue, you can just pose the question, or probably the question you are looking for or the problem you are facing has already been posted by someone else, so you will probably find already a solution. And last but not the least, the newest version of Bootstrap 5 is much more customizable than the previous one, which means that you can adjust it easily to your needs. Okay, so what we will cover in this crash course, so what we already discussed, what Bootstrap is. So I'm gonna also give you a small comparison. Now next, the other shift to make this library even more lighter was to make almost every option available as a data attribute. So what we can do, we can just change and adjust it using HTML, for example, in components like Toast. We can change almost any option just with use of data attribute. Then we have some changes and enhancement in the grid system, which is core of Bootstrap, enhanced modularity, customization, some new components, helpers, utilities, and variation. Some of the components were removed, like Jumbotron. And what I really like also about the Bootstrap 5 is that they work really hard on its own, on their own set of icons, which in my opinion is great. So as far as jQuery is concerned, jQuery brought definitely a lot to web development network, to web development society, and it's been used by millions or billions probably people around the world for last decade and a half. And this change obviously is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, the most crucial one, because the Bootstrap 5 will be significantly lighter on file size and page load moving forward. But what is also very important here is that you can still use Bootstrap 5 components with jQuery. So if you want to do that, you can still initialize them with jQuery. Bootstrap 5 make it possible, which assure you a smooth transition between Bootstrap 4 and Bootstrap 5. Next, as I mentioned, although in Bootstrap 4 there were already some variables, but there were just a few main ones. Thanks to dropping support for internet